Capital is abundant. Understanding is scarce. The Dynamo Show goes deep with the new industrialists rejuvenating industry and commerce. Brought to you by Dynamo Ventures. Learn more at dynamo.vc/podcast. Now, here's your host, Madelyn O'Farrell.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Dynamo Show. I'm your host, Madelyn O'Farrell, and I'm excited to be joined today by Mike Matson, co-founder and CEO of Birch Geothermal. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Madelyn.
Before we dive into the exciting world of geothermal, can you give us your personal story? What was that journey that really led you to co-founding Birch?
No, absolutely. It's been a long and winding journey, so it's been a lot of fun. I guess it starts, I graduated high school right when 9/11 hit and was part of the cohort that went into the military and service after that happened. So I started at the Naval Academy, served in the U.S. Navy, and then when I discharged out, came back home to Houston and started a family. So married my wife, Samantha. We've now been married 20 years this year, and started a family on the south side of Houston. Began grad school at Rice University, and I did anti-cancer drug design. So I did a PhD research program at Rice University and found out very quickly that while I was decent at research, it wasn't my passion. I actually really enjoyed the educational side. So I stayed in academia for a few years as a tenure track professor in the University of Houston system, really acting more as the Mr. Wizard of Houston. So think blowing up gummy bears for elementary school students, tie-dyed lab coats over at the Children's Museum. Probably my claim to fame in that period was I wrote the yellow-covered inorganic chemistry for dummies. So a popularizer and a passionate communicator of chemistry. And about 2013, give or take, was when I left academia and went into upstream oil and gas. The industry was hot then at that point in time, and there was a lot of exciting challenges ahead. And so I joined a firm called Kinder Morgan. Most folks will know of them as a pipeline or a midstream company, but they have a small portion of their assets are actually what's known as EOR, Enhanced Oil Recovery Assets in West Texas. So really started in industry as a petroleum engineer. My title there was reservoir engineer. So for those that don't know the subsurface, it's the folks that inject and produce out of the subsurface and really understand the dynamic flows of how the rock and the oil and the solvents and all the other materials are interacting. And so develop tools to help understand how we could optimize oil production. And then actually, I kind of a random side story, but call it a midlife crisis. I took a detour. I took a 2-month leave of absence, and myself and a crew of 3, we took a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a big publicity stunt to raise money for the Rice University rowing team. And, spending that time away, no emails, and just really kind of concentrating and getting to think on where my passions were, I realized that I wanted to get back into the operations. Military background, I'd been a volunteer firefighter for many years, wanted to get back to dirty boots. And so that's when I shifted and became a drilling engineer. I was working in the Permian, so we were drilling vertical wells, something about 7,000 foot TD, give or take, and we were running a pretty aggressive drilling program. I think at my peak, I had 4 drilling rigs underneath me drilling simultaneously. Really enjoyed that. It was an excellent career, but ultimately, I made the decision when I was there to make the transition to clean energy. And what I actually saw and witnessed was I drilled my first CO2 production well. So it was a wellbore that I drilled to produce pure CO2 to inject in these EOR projects. And my personal belief is EOR is great if you're going to make a barrel of oil and you're going to use that. I want it to be as low carbon as possible. And EOR is one of the mechanisms we can do to help mitigate that. But I do believe that if you're going to do that, it should be anthropogenic CO2. We have more than enough globally that we're producing. We should be capturing that and figuring out how to use that as our injectant. And so I transferred there from Kinder and actually joined the low carbon venture group over at Occidental. And so I was working on one of the fields that eventually would be targeted to take CO2 from their Net Power project, which is a novel clean tech natural gas system. And so was able to kind of work on that a little bit and ultimately left the patch altogether. So about 2020, height of COVID, I uprooted the family. We moved into the Denver area and I joined a carbon capture startup called Carbon America. So led projects for them, was there for about 2 years. There was also a short stint in there at a second clean tech startup that was a thermal energy storage company. So think a heat battery. We built the world's largest concrete battery, deployed that at a power plant down in Birmingham, Alabama, and then joined Boston Consulting Group. So this was summer of 2022. The Biden administration had just passed the IRA, and incentives were coming in for a lot of these clean tech projects. And so I joined Boston Consulting Group as an expert to help advise on some of the industrial dynamics of low carbon solutions. And so joined the Climate Sustainability Group, and then eventually became a partner in the firm and found that my passion was geothermal, where I had this unique vantage point to look across all of my clients' portfolios of how they were framing and looking at the low carbon solution path in front of them. And geothermal, in my opinion, was one of the only technologies that was winning across all of the various buckets. So it was winning in costs were coming down. It was winning in timeline. We saw those getting expedited. It had bipartisan support. It really was kind of one of the more attractive things. And of course, coming from a subsurface background, it really resonated with my understanding of the technology. And so eventually stepped in and led that globally for the firm. And that's kind of eventually what led to me stepping out and starting Birch.
You make an interesting point around the bipartisan nature of geothermal. Notably, a lot of the clean tech incentives that were in the IRA and similar legislation have been rolled back in the one big beautiful bill, but geothermal is kind of the exception to that. It's had some durability. Given your experience here, why do you think that is?
No, I think it's great. I think, I gave this analogy the other day when I was talking to some folks on the bipartisan nature of some of the various clean techs, and one of the ones of I spent a good chunk of my career in the carbon capture space, and we always described it as bipartisan. And if you look at the incentives in CCS have been very bipartisan. They have they were originally penned by Obama, and then you can see extensions through Biden's administration and Trump's administrations. So there's definitely been kind of both sides of the aisle have supported it. But what I noticed about the carbon capture is that it's the extremes that tend to not be as bullish on the tech. If you go too far on either side of the political spectrum, you start hearing comments like, well, this is just enabling fossil fuels, and my tax dollars shouldn't be doing that. And if you go to the other side, it's, this is just wasted money and burden on projects because climate change isn't actually happening and we shouldn't be putting money towards that. Geothermal, on the other hand, from my vantage, has really brought in the full spectrum of the bipartisanship. And that to me, I think, is what resonates the most. As you go to the far ends of the extremes, it's still drill, baby, drill, or it is clean, dispatchable baseload power. And those narratives really resonate, I think, all the way to the extremes of that political spectrum. And it really does strike me as one of the few technologies that there really is a lot of handshaking across that aisle, and all sides seem to see the benefits of the technology.
Makes sense, and certainly appreciate that perspective. Would love to dive deeper into geothermal and what you're building, but first, let's set the stage. What is Birch and why are you building it?
Yeah, no, happy to. Birch gets our namesake from Francis Birch. He was a scientist out of Harvard, a professor there, and he actually started at the Manhattan Project during the war. But what he was a seismologist, and so he studied the subsurface, and Birch's law, which is associated with him, is how we associate the speed of sound in the subsurface relative to the rock's density. And so it was kind of how we made our initial understanding of the subsurface without a penetration of a wellbore. And so that's kind of, the sciencey underlying of Birch. And if you look at my co-founding team, there's 3 PhDs around the table. And then birch trees, which is, kind of our symbol, are the first moving populator trees in a new forest. And so, they're fast growing trees. They populate very quickly. And I think that's very aligned with kind of our thesis of being rooted in speed and being able to bring EGS projects to scale quickly. So that's kind of the namesake of the firm. But I think at our core, what we see ahead of us is this second generation wave of EGS projects. So for those that aren't familiar, EGS or Enhanced Geothermal Systems are a methodology in geothermal where we have actually kind of transitioned as an industry, and all these are happening in simultaneous nature. I mean, there's so many great advancements happening in lots of different areas of geothermal, but in the enhanced specifically, we have kind of transitioned from drilling for fluid, what can commonly be called hydrothermal. So that's, think Iceland or New Zealand or Northern California, where I drill into hot water. What we're doing is drilling into heat and using that hot rock to effectively turn the earth into a radiator. So we apply our own fluid. We let the hot rock that is down there warm that fluid. We produce that back and are able to turn that warm fluid into electrons. And Birch sees, I think, just a lot of excitement right now in the industry. And there has been some great advancements, especially just this year alone, for the EGS community, and advancements with a lot of different companies that are really starting to understand how to unlock the Earth's potential to capture this EGS. And we see our position in the marketplace to really try to help optimize it and figure out how we make these projects last longer, have more durability, and reduce some of the risk that's currently associated with some of these first of a kind projects, and kind of just continue to advance the industry.
On that point of some of the exciting things happening in this market right now, Fervo just closed one of the largest clean energy IPOs in history at a 10 billion plus market cap. What is that moment, as someone who's been sitting kind of inside the geothermal ecosystem for a number of years, what does that feel like, and what do you think that means for enhanced geothermal?
I couldn't be more excited or proud for the team over there. I remember at one of the events where Fervo was kind of showing the Cape Station off to a group of investors, and BCG was one of the consultancies they were kind enough to invite. They took me off to the side, and they had made the comment that I was one of the only individuals that had made like all of their tech days and all of their ribbon cuttings and events with invites, and was one of their biggest fans. And I think that has not changed in the slightest. Could not be happier for what that means. I think it's an incredible market signal. From my perspective, that truly has taken my conversations that even as short as 18 months ago, where what is this technology, and is it even possible, and is it real, and a lot of skepticism. And I think this really has given that large market dynamic of folks are recognizing these are viable. And I think that, it's not a standalone IPO either. I mean, it's all the success they had raising to that point. And I think perhaps even most notably, the non-recourse debt that they were able to get on their project, and convince the large banking institutions to lend against at the project level. Those are all incredibly strong signs for the signal, for the industry and the market. And then so many other great players as well. I mean, I think that, there is a sea of EGS and closed loop players and hydrothermal players that are, able to take the excitement right now on geothermal at large, and really be able to advance and continue to grow projects. And so that gets me just really excited for the years ahead.
Love to hear it. You threw out a tagline there, rooted in speed. What does that speed really mean when we're talking about geothermal timelines, and what are you compressing to achieve it?
Yeah, I think right now, I think in a nutshell, like looking at our industry as a whole, one of the ways that we're going to grow, which right now, I mean, to be candid, geothermal is a rounding error on the U.S. power mix, and I and many others see that growing and more geothermal coming online to where it's no longer in the quote other category when you look at what the power mix is comprised of. The demand right now from the hyperscalers is really surging necessity to bring power online. And it's almost an insatiable demand right now where we're at. I mean, it just the narratives that are out there and the companies that I have talked to. I mean, we're at a point now where arrows are actually getting, or literally, basically jet engines that have been removed from a jet. I'm oversimplifying. They're slapped to a skid and brought out on site. Folks are using that to generate electrons, which, just to that level of I just need power. And so it creates this really interesting market dynamic right now of speed to power is going to be critically important. And we're hearing more and more from the data centers, from the hyperscalers, how important that is. And what I get very excited about is the geothermal community, specifically the EGS community, and others as well within it, are targeting a different supply chain than what a lot of the traditional fastest power to market would be, which is a natural gas turbine. And if you go out and talk to most of those vendors right now, if I raise my hand and say I want a natural gas turbine, and you put me on the line of orders, you're looking potentially at 4 to 5 years before you're even in their book of business. And so that's a pretty long delivery timeline there, which brings geothermal for the first time into competition on a speed and a timeline basis. So I think just as an industry, we're seeing that speed and necessity that geothermal is coming on. And a lot of great advancements from wonderful people that have advanced the industry to this point. For example, just one example, we've seen at the federal level, there's been a lot of categorical exemptions to try to expedite permitting and remove some of the duplicity and some of the things that were slowing down the process unnecessarily. We still, of course, want to make sure that it's done safe and properly, but we want to make sure that it's not to excess. To bring these projects online quicker. And so we've seen a lot of really positive traction. I think from Birch's angle, part of our narrative is kind of where we're playing. And we see a ton of activity and a lot of excitement here in the Mountain West. That's traditionally where a lot of these EGS projects are going to have the early projects. And the reason for that is very oversimplified. The thermal gradient, or how deep I need to drill to access the heat I want to generate from the subsurface, is shallower. I don't need to drill as deep, say, for example, in Utah as I would in Pennsylvania to get the same level of heat. And so that makes my costs lower. And so therefore it's more optimized to produce power. My economics on my project look better. I think right now, we are starting to see that first step out into other states that are eyeing up bringing the first electrons to the grid. So for example, my home state of Colorado, we currently don't have any electrons on the grid, but there are a lot of places within the state that have excellent potential to bring geothermal projects online. And so I think there's going to be, a lot of demand right now that is going to enable people to step out into some of these surrounding states and continue to advance projects and figure out how to get the right consortiums and partnerships to really expedite these projects, to get the right experts in to bring these online quickly.
I'm actually from Utah, which is part of what sparked my pet interest in geothermal. Fervo, one of their commercial projects, is in Utah. Zanskar, a scale-up startup in geothermal, is based in Provo. And many years ago, part of what got me interested in it was all of this natural gas infrastructure that existed already along the mountain range. And there's all this talk about how there's kind of transferable skills, transferable equipment between the oil and gas industry and geothermal because of a lot of those subsurface similarities. But you've actually worked in oil and gas. Now you're working in geothermal. How real is that? What do you think actually transfers versus doesn't?
Oh, I think the vast majority does. If you go out and look and do some of the literature reviews from a lot of the great groups out there that have really dove into the workforce for geothermal, I think most would say it's something on the tune of about 80 to 90% of the skill set in an oil and gas company from the subsurface perspective are directly transferable to the geothermal. There's that kind of 10 to 15% of learned skills of understanding heat flow, understanding some of the fracture dynamics and the higher temperatures. There's slightly different corrosion concerns and things like that. So there's definitely some adapting that's there, but the underlying base core set is there. And I think the biggest one to me, more than anything, is the oil and gas industry's ability to innovate. And I mean, we saw this through the shale, revolution that kind of just really unlocked so many technological advancements and what we're able to do. I expect that same ingenuity and creativity, the R&D that underlies it, the large network of oil and field service providers and rig groups and supporting agencies that go into all of these projects, the legal, it's just such a wide net that are all very well primed to step into this. The other thing that I would throw out there is, coming from my BCG background, there was a lot of very existential questions coming out of the oil and gas industry as well, as far as talent recruitment. Some of the universities that are known for their petroleum programs have hit record lows for enrollment. The younger generations coming in have, not had the same interest or view the oil and gas industry the same as generations previous. And so there's been questions on how do we continue to, keep this really strong skill set of great paying jobs and rewarding, energy providing services. How do we continue to incentivize that? And I think geothermal really helps address that concern. When you talk to the younger generations that are looking at colleges now or looking at their first career paths, geothermal, because of a lot of the nice benefits that come with being a clean baseload provider, which kind of detangles you a little bit from some of the negative associations sometimes brought into oil and gas, really resonates. And so I think that's also incredibly attractive to the workforce that's coming in, and we're seeing a lot of excitement, I think, with that generation as well. So I think it's very highly skill set comparable. I think it's enticing and going to bring more folks into the fold, and hopefully we can continue really leading the way and understanding our innovation and our ability to continue to develop.
Interesting. I hadn't considered the transferability of kind of the workforce and education component, but that's a fascinating point. You've previously stated that Birch's thesis is really about the ability to scale without a green premium, kind of scaling on its own merits. How do you think about practically achieving that, and what needs to be true in order for that to be achieved?
No, I think there's quite a bit, and I think it's an aggressive statement, to be determined if we're fully there yet. But I think right now the premiums that we're seeing, and a lot of that goes back to my original statement on it really is speed. Here, a good example, even a year ago when I was talking to most of my colleagues in the data center world, they were really getting hammered on 99.9999 uptime. And you'll hear the 4 nines and the 5 nines and how reliable is your power upline. And we're hearing that is softening, and a lot of that softening is coming from just the necessity for power. And so I think your ability to bring electrons on and be able to actually hit these timelines is going to be motivating a lot of these buyers. One, I think the other thing that we're seeing is that there are pressures at the utility level, at some of the internal metrics for the power producers and other agencies to actually lower their carbon portfolio and lower the carbon grid. And so I think that they're feeling pressure. So, for example, we've seen legislation here recently in Colorado where they're actually requiring some of these utilities to understand how they're going to bid some of these clean electrons and geothermal electrons onto their bid, to kind of open that up and make sure that they have pathways to bringing that into the grid to decarbonize. California just came out, I think, with like 2 gigawatts of a requirement. So, I mean, we're definitely seeing states interestingly, a lot of the states that are leaning into this are in the Mountain West. So there's a nice synergy there of there is access to heat, there is a desire for clean baseload power, and those are overlaying. So we're seeing that come in as well. And then I think the last thing on just coming down the cost curve, we've seen amazing advancements even just in the last year, from a lot of these startups and now public companies as well on their initial drills and what their costs are and how they are learning to come down that cost curve. And we saw this in the shale industry. So this is not, I don't feel like this is reinventing the wheel here. I think that there is a roadmap that has been done and successfully on how do you actually lower your timeline for drilling and your ability to increase your rate of penetration and make sure that it's successful. The bit technologies are advancing, the drilling technologies are advancing. We've got a lot of great companies that are stepping out into the EGS space and developing tools specifically for our industry. And I think when you take those all, and couple all those together, we really start seeing a lot of costs down. So we see a high willingness to pay for power. We see even potentially a higher one if it's clean. But that's coupled with a decreasing cost curve. And I think where those two meet is kind of that sweet spot where EGS really has, at least, especially in this near term with such high demand, to really kind of get a foothold and start, seeing multi-megawatts to gigawatts of deployment and getting into that portfolio.
On your point around speed, I think we're at such an interesting moment because you have this almost counterintuitive consequence or externality from the AI infrastructure build out, where hyperscalers and others building data center infrastructure have so much pent up demand and such a high willingness to pay that they're almost willing to pay a green premium without thinking of it as a green premium, just because it's all about speed to power. So the consequence of this build out might actually be that it's an inflection point for scaling enhanced geothermal and some of these other nascent but very powerful technologies. And on that point, I would love your perspective as someone who's been in this space, is building something new. What's your realistic prediction for where geothermal sits within the broader US energy mix, call it 10 years from now?
That's a good push. I think in 10 years, I think that we, as I said before, we go from being a rounding error to actually being a firm power wedge. I would estimate that in a 10-year window, we are looking at, a few more gigawatts of geothermal being deployed in the Mountain West. For scale, right now, the U.S. sits somewhere around 4 gigawatts. I think it's very realistic to think that we could double that or more in a 10-year time span. If we continue to get the traction and deployment levels that we're hoping to achieve on these projects. I think there's a lot of what ifs that are in there, but what I see very promising, and again, every industry is going to face its supply chain concerns, and EGS is no exception to that. But I think that right now, because it is a growing industry that has ability to really kind of scale up here in the near term for this deployment, I think that will enable the industry to really kind of bring a lot of these electrons onto the grid. And whether that's our existing infrastructure that's out there that's building these, in EGS, we typically use a turbine called an ORC, or an organic rankine cycle engine. And so those ORC turbines that we're getting, there is supply chain that's out there. Those are being manufactured. But we're also even just seeing, even on the top side, new and creative companies that are out there. One of my colleagues over at a firm out in Hawthorne that spun out of SpaceX, and a group of their engineers, that's exactly what they're focusing on, is how do we enable the deployment of that. And so I think that what we're going to see on this 10-year timeline is a growing industry that is meeting this instant demand that's going to allow that really rapid scale up.
On that point of the what ifs that exist, what needs to be true for kind of that vision of a 10-year growth in geothermal? And are there picks and shovels that need to come to fruition to make that happen? Thinking about this from the perspective of a venture investor, where we're looking for pockets of opportunity, what are those pockets in your mind in the geothermal landscape?
No, I think there's a lot of room for optimization and continuing to grow. And I think that's kind of core to Birch's thesis of how we play. And we are, I would say, tech enabled, but tech agnostic. We are not going all in on this is the winning technology, or this is exactly how we're going to do every single one of our projects. There's flexibility, and we want to be a good project developer there. But there are a lot of picks and shovels devices that are going to help us enable and come down the cost curve. And I think specifically the way that we frame it is, kind of as we go into this next generation of EGS wells that are going to have a little bit more, call it decoration on the wellbore, that should unlock some of the longevity concerns, some of the water loss concerns. What's my thermal decline? The more that we can mitigate these sorts of risks and continue to make those lower and lower, the picks and shovels companies will help enable that. And so, there's quite a widespread from a VC mindset of what will enable that. Coming from a project developer lens, it's part of that's going to be in how I drill my wells. So there's drilling companies that are out there, all the way from novel bits that can handle existing drilling rigs to completely novel designs like Quays, which is using cyclotron technology to effectively blast the rock. Really, and everything in between, right? So we see advancements there. We see advancements in how these wellbores themselves will function on a flow dynamic. And so that's, one of the things that I would say my crew is leaning in very heavily on, which is how do I ensure that all these various fractures in the subsurface are taking water equitably and flowing consistently, and I don't get a thief zone or a water loss zone that I'm really concerned about, and how can I mitigate that? There's going to be monitoring devices. What do I actually deploy to make sure that I can get feedback from these systems and make sure that they live up to their lifespan that I hope to achieve? There's going to be a lot of topside equipment advancements. And to be candid, it's something that is relatively new because historically, a lot of these projects have been relatively bespoke projects that were on a smaller scale. I go out to Nevada and drive by a bunch of the geothermal sites out there, and they're, tens to dozens of megawatts of power that were on a custom bespoke sort of ORC. And so what we're seeing now is this idea of modularity deployment, and how do I optimize my design on the surface, and what's the winning combination? What's the right size? How do I adjust for, summer hots and winter colds that are going to, change my delta T on my ORC system, and what's the creative solutions that are being designed there? And then even a step further, we're seeing folks that are, going to take a lot of these picks and shovels devices and use them for other ways to play. So maybe it's not just baseload. I mean, that's what my firm is focusing on, but perhaps there's dispatchable, or there is other ways that we can, generate these electrons that would have value. So I think there's a lot of advancements there on the surface as well. And then there's just the overarching, investments that will enable power generation in general. And I think we still have a lot to learn there on how we fix our grid, how we fix our interconnections, the technological advances there to help enable that and lower costs so that we can bring these electrons to where they need significantly quicker. And so I think that's another thing that's still out there.
Incredibly helpful. Well, Mike, thank you so much for your perspective today. It was wonderful to pick your brain.
No, absolutely a pleasure. Wonderful chatting, Madelyn.
All right. Well, thank you to Mike, and to our listeners, thank you again for tuning in. We will see you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked. And be sure to head over to podcast.dynamo.vc to keep up to date with our latest content, or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Until next time.